everyone, I'm Sara Maher, Publishing Manager at Western National Parks Association. I'd like to welcome you to today's Authors in Conversation series. The Tucson Festival of Books, along with these live events, are made possible by more than 200 sponsors and more than 1,000 local volunteers. Special thanks to the Arizona Daily Star, the University of Arizona, and Tucson Medical Center, the festival's 3 presenting sponsors. Today's conversation is presented by Western National Parks Association, a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service since 1938 and sponsor of the National Park Experience Pavilion at the Tucson Festival of Books. To keep up to date with the festival's live online events and sign up for the festival newsletter, visit TucsonFestivalofBooks.org. So joining me today is Bryan Walsh. Bryan is a graduate of Princeton University and worked as a foreign correspondent, reporter, and editor for Time for over 15 years. He founded the award-winning eco-centric blog on Time.com and has reported from more than 20 countries on science and environmental stories like SARS, global warming, and extinction. He is also the founder and editor of technology and science site 10. His book is End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World. Bryan, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So this book is about existential risks, which are risks which could eliminate all of humanity or enough of humanity that survivors would not be able to rebuild society to what it is now, hence end times. So let's start with the big question, are these the end times?
Well, it certainly feels that way, and it feels even more that way than it did when I finished the book and published it in August of last year. What the book really explains is that we are in a unique period of existential peril, which that means is that we have both, you said that big natural disasters that could always have happened to us. I mean, the dinosaurs that were knocked out by an asteroid, a supervolcano, something like that. But what's really changing now is that we have new technology that's, very powerful and also giving us a way to quite literally destroy ourselves, whether that's new forms of artificial intelligence, new forms of biotechnology that could lead to pandemics far worse than what we're experiencing now. Of course, natural pandemics themselves. All this means is that we're in a period of time when our power is getting ahead of our ability to control it. It's a very dangerous place to be, and that's what I really tried to focus on.
So going off of that, the book does cover many types of existential risks, from asteroids to artificial intelligence to aliens. So how did you choose specifically which threats to cover in the book, and were there any that you now wish you had included?
Well, I really tried to focus on the ones that, from talking to the experts and going through the research, posed the biggest threat to the future of humanity. That meant ones like nuclear war, which maybe is something that's kind of receded into the background, but it is a very real danger. It's probably the biggest danger that could happen right now, this moment. And then it was also looking at, further along to those newer technologies that aren't quite there yet in terms of the risk, but are very close to really presenting that. And then lastly, I was looking also at those big natural risks that we've seen happen before in the history of the Earth. Now, the Earth is billions of years old, but in this case, they could happen again, not very likely, but they were ones I definitely wanted to include. In terms of ones I didn't get a chance to include that I kind of wish I had, apparently people are very interested in space weather, solar flares or things like that could knock out the power grid. So I kind of wish I sort of had focused a little bit on that, but the book itself was it says brief guide, but it got a little less brief than I expected. So I'm kind of glad with the ones I ended up including.
Well, maybe the second edition, we can add more of the space stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, the sequel.
So let's focus on one of the topics you cover, which is climate change. You write that climate change is unlike any of the other risks covered in the book for a few reasons. One of those reasons is that it is largely out of control of our individual actions. So you discuss several high-level things that scientists are working on right now, but are there any normal things that everyday people can do to help reverse climate change?
What I always tell people is that the biggest thing you can do about climate change is act politically. Climate change is a big collective action problem. That's why it's really hard for individuals to make a difference. Obviously, you can act greener and you can make a difference on your own carbon footprint, but that's obviously just a tiny drop in the big bucket that is climate change. So if we're really going to make a difference, we need to innovate new technologies. We need to pass laws that restrict carbon emissions, that put money towards infrastructure that can help us adapt to climate change. And the way you do that is through political action, and that can take any number of forms. It can simply take voting for quite, those candidates that actually do care about this issue and will spend money and resources on it, it can take the form of direct action. I mean, it's been really impressive to see young people like Greta Thunberg really take to the streets and make a difference in this issue. So ultimately, that's, to me, what makes a difference when it comes to what you're doing with climate change. While, it matters what you do individually for yourself and what you signal to the rest of the people, we really have to do this together as a society, as a country, and as a world.
So what do you think are the most significant contributors to climate change right now?
The biggest significant, the most significant contributors really are the energy we use. So ultimately, that's how do we generate electricity? How much are we using it? And that's, the single biggest factor there is, are we using fossil fuels like coal, for instance? Are we using oil or natural gas, which is a bit cleaner, but still is a fossil fuel? Or are we switching to renewables? Or we've been switching to ones like nuclear power that are clean, even if they have other environmental issues? So ultimately, it is really a question about how do we power the world? And if we can't figure out a way to do that, in a cleaner fashion, that will create really dangerous climate change. And I would urge people both on their personal level, because you can make a difference there individually with what, the power you're using. But again, that's a situation where we need to think about collectively, how do we change that as a country?
All right, so you've already answered this question a little bit with that answer, but there is a lot going on in the world all the time, especially right now, and people's attention is being pulled in many different directions. So why does climate change deserve some of that attention right now?
Well, climate change is one of those problems that just gets worse and worse with every passing year. It compounds, which is really unusual. You have something like nuclear war where it's kind of always present in the background. Maybe it gets a little bit worse, gets a little bit better, but it's kind of there. But it doesn't if you don't act on it now, it doesn't change necessarily. But every year we wait to act on climate change, it compounds almost like a debt. That's kind of the way I like to think about it. The same way you take out a loan, if you don't make your interest payments, if you don't pay down your principal, it gets bigger and bigger. The same thing is true with climate change. So while there's always going to be other issues that, in the moment will have a more pressing claim on our attention, I can think of a lot right now, if we don't put climate change, if not first and foremost or very far up there in terms of the priorities we're looking at, we'll just continue to lose ground, continue to lose territory. It'll be harder and harder for us to avert one of the most dangerous, even catastrophic consequences.
All right, well, on that note, is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about climate change or talk about, or are you ready to move on to another threat to our existence?
So many threats. No, what I really like to focus on is the need for technology and technological innovation. We need to think about ways to potentially take carbon directly out of the atmosphere, and that's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be easy, but the reality is that things are getting so out of hand and will get so out of hand in a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades time. We might need those somewhat extreme solutions. Better if we begin to invest in them now, experiment and trial them now, so we aren't left kind of grasping for emergency measures after the fact when we don't even know what the side effects might be.
All right. Well, let's shift over to pandemics, which is a shockingly relevant topic right now. In May 2017, you wrote a cover story for Time called "The World is Not Ready for the Next Pandemic." In that, you wrote that the consequences of a major pandemic would be world-changing. Do you think we are at that point with COVID-19?
Well, I think COVID-19 is going to be world-changing. I don't think it will lead to the end of the world. As viruses go, this one's just not deadly enough, even though it is truly awful, and every life lost to it is one too many. Rather, it really shows how much even a disease that does not rank among history's greatest killers can alter the course of history, alter the course of countries, alter the course of the entire world. And what that really underscores to me is how interconnected we are. That's what we really learned here, in the sense that both how this disease came about and how it began to spread around the world shows that connection, but also the sort of knock-on effects, the economic effects that spread globally just as fast as the virus does, the political effects that have changed the relationship of countries to each other. The fact that we're actually rolling back globalization to a certain extent because of this pandemic. And again, this is not the apocalyptic virus that we've all feared, and yet it can do this much damage, and we've mishandled it that badly. That to me really worries me about what could come next.
So when you first started working as a journalist for Time magazine, you were a former correspondent stationed in East Asia, where you were when SARS started. So in the book, you write that this was the first emerging global disease of the 21st century. It came out of nowhere and exposed how vulnerable our modern world was to diseases like this, as you just mentioned. So now you're writing about COVID-19. So how would the pandemic chapter of this book be different if you were writing it now during COVID-19?
Well, it would definitely be a lot longer, although I have a hard time figuring out how do I conclude it because I don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19, and I've become a little wary of making those kind of predictions. But to me, COVID-19 shows even much more than SARS just how a 21st century virus really works. I mean, SARS was a surprise, it was deadly, it was dangerous, but ultimately it didn't really have the ability to spread around the world. So that's why it had sort of isolated outbreaks outside places like Hong Kong and other parts of China, but it never really took off in that way. I mean, COVID-19 passed the case count and death toll of SARS within a couple of weeks. And we've seen how it has gone around the entire world. So I would really focus on this disease. And also I would write and spend more time focusing on how you can mismanage this. We think of pandemics as natural, which they are. They come out of nature. They're not entirely predictable. But they're man-made disasters when they're mismanaged badly. And that's something we have really no excuse for, and frankly, not something I predicted. I would have thought we'd handle this better than we did. And this sort of really shows how, poor government on the part of not just the US, but a lot of other countries can take a natural disaster, turn it into a much worse man-made one.
All right. Well, the sense I got from reading your book is that the way to address the fears one might have about any or all of these possible existential risks, or even more personal, localized risks, is to learn about them. Do you have some recommendations for resources besides your book, which can help people learn about and deal with everything happening right now?
Well, there are a few other books that are really good on this, that some of which have come out since my book came out. There's one called The Precipice, which is a book by an Oxford scholar named Toby Ord, who really goes in depth into the science, the philosophy of existential risk in a more academic way, but still very readable. And if you really want to get deeply into the subject, that's a great book to read. And also to think about the ethics of it. We often think, well, averting the end of the world is good for us, but he really makes the case that what really matters is keeping that future along for our children, our grandchildren, everyone who comes after us. And I look also at the work of other academic institutions in this field. The Cambridge Center on Existential Risk does really great work. They put out papers, blog posts. Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford does that as well. They're one of the oldest ones in this field. And there are a few other ones here in the United States that have really grown up around this. And so, that's what I would recommend the books. I would recommend those academic centers. And there's really even a website called 80,000 Hours that looks at how best to spend your career averting existential risk. So, should you go and work in Congress? Should you go be a scientist in a bio lab? They really go in depth into that. Really great podcast, really great site.
Great, thank you. So what are you working on now? Can we look forward to a second edition of End Times, or is there something new in progress?
Well, I'm currently the future correspondent at the news site Axios, and I realize that's a strange job title. It makes it sound like I will be a correspondent in the future, but rather I focus on the future as a subject. So looking at emerging technologies like AI, like biotechnology, looking at big global political trends, demographic trends. So I read a twice weekly newsletter called Axios Future. If you go to the Axios site, you can find it, sign up for it. I personally recommend it. I enjoy it a lot. So that's kind of what I'm focusing a lot of my time on now. And within that, a lot on the pandemic, a lot on the effect of AI on how we live, how we work. That's a big subject I'm focusing on. And I would definitely potentially come back to this. I think we'll have new ways the world can end within the next few years. I'd love to write more about them. I'd love to talk about them. So definitely something I'm keeping an eye on.
Great. Is there anything else you would like to say to everyone listening right now?
No, I mean, I think COVID-19 has really shown us that our world is not as stable, not as maybe we hoped or assumed it was. And I really hope that even after we do eventually defeat this disease, and I have every confidence that we will, we'll take a lesson here, which is that it's much better to prepare for these risks, to act to head them off as early as possible, than to wait until after they've metastasized like a cancer. Can you imagine how many lives, how much money, how much political disruption would have been saved if we've been able to snuff out this disease early on the way we were actually with SARS and with other similar outbreaks. So I think that's an important lesson to take, and it can really play out not just with diseases, but with climate change, with conflict, with any kind of major threat, preparation is the way to go, especially when, the last thing you want is to try to figure out a way to survive after the end of the world.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. That is all we have time for today. So Bryan, thank you again for joining us. And Bryan's book is End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World from Hachette Books. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to watch. Stay safe and happy reading.